Missed an episode of your favorite podcast? Choose from over a decade of content in our archives, not just the latest episode. All free at GCNlive.com.
This is your call to action. Get prepared, America. Economy, survival, energy, disasters. This is USAPrepares.com. Informative radio, educational radio. Interact now by emailing instructor@USAPrepares.com or text at 434-390-7953. Class, please take your seats. Now, your instructor, Vincent Finelli.
This is your captain speaking, John Regan. I've been sitting in this week for Vincent. You know, he's a farmer, and there's no end to the work that you need to do when you're raising a bunch of critters, and you just can't put it off. So I'm happy to help out, and it's also given me the opportunity to bring in some of the people that will be sharing the stage at the Hear the Watchman conference in Dallas. And that's going to be March 31st through April 2nd. Their website is hearthewatchmen.com. I recommend you get your tickets now before they run out. It's going to be something else. And with me today is Derek Gilbert from Skywatch TV. He and his wife Sharon are going to be at the conference. And looking at what he's got to present, it's going to be a pretty good show. Welcome to USA Prepares, Derek.
John, it's my honor to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, we know you host Skywatch TV. Is there anything else you'd like to tell about us before we get into your subject?
Lifelong Cubs fan, finally vindicated after 55 years of on this earth. Last fall, so that's a good thing. It kind of came to this late in life. My wife was a very early believer. From as long as she could remember, she knew that the Bible was true, and her parents actually had to hold her back from making a confession of faith until they thought she knew what she was talking about. Me, on the other hand, even though I accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior when I was about in the 6th grade, I never really understood what that meant. I'm one of those guys that has to see the evidence. I guess I inherited my father's engineer's brain in that regard. So when it took me until my mid-30s to really understand that the Bible is history, that it's true. And in our study of the Bible, a weekly online Bible study that Sharon and I do, I stumbled across some things in the Old Testament that made me ask some questions. Why did this have to happen this way? And that's what led to the book, The Great Inception.
Yeah, and it's amazing, especially this age that we live in. There's so many things in the Bible that we couldn't understand before some of the science and technology of the 20th and 21st centuries.
Yeah, and archaeology has played a big role in this. And this is, I guess, the Lord sort of created me in a unique way. And I'll mention my wife again. I'm thankful for her because she's probably the only woman on the planet who gets me and understands the way I think. But, I was the debate team captain in high school for 2 years, made it to the Illinois State Championship tournament 2 years running. Didn't do well at the state level, but at least we qualified. So that's kind of my mindset. I want the evidence, and then I want to debate and come to the truth of a matter. I want to establish my position on evidence. Now, we speculate on some things in the book, but I try to label speculation as such. But there's plenty of evidence out there that's been discovered, dug up out of the ground in Iraq, in Syria, in Turkey, Lebanon, Israel over the past 200 years. And, of course, the secular world is looking at it and saying, well, see, this just proves that the Hebrew Bible was copied from the ancient Mesopotamians. When in fact it's the other way around. You're getting just a different version of the same story. It's like getting two versions of a news story, one from Fox News and the other from Al Jazeera or something. But when you start looking at things that scholars know about ancient history, you realize that it supports the narrative of the Bible. It's just that information never seems to make it into our churches. The other track that has affected what we hear in church these days is that we've sort of de-supernaturalized the Bible to the point where it's been washed out, and it comes across to many in the church pews as nothing but a guide for better living. Live your best life today, or just a long list of thou shalt nots. When in fact the Bible is an exciting record of a long war that's been fought between the creator of the universe and these lesser gods, and I use that word deliberately, who rebelled against him.
And, along those lines, it's surprising how the church basically doesn't pay attention to spirit. It doesn't really understand blood. We talk about the blood of Jesus, but because we've been divorced from doing things God's ways, we don't even process our own animals to understand that at a natural level. However, on the flip side, Satanists definitely understand the power of blood, and they use it and are performing animal and even human sacrifices.
Yeah, it's a real war that we've been deployed into, and most people are out on the battlefield with blindfolds on. I was in my mid-30s before I ever heard blood preached in a church, and was raised going to Sunday school every week, raised going to church every week until I got into college. Then I kind of fell away, but began attending again in my late 20s, early 30s, but it wasn't until my mid-30s that I began hearing any preaching from the pulpit on the blood of Jesus, or on prophecy, for that matter. And so the Great Inception kind of looks at the nature of this long war, the significance of holy mountains from Eden to Armageddon. That's the subtitle of the book, Satan's Psyops from Eden to Armageddon, and lays out a prophetic timeline, a scenario that I think is plausible, that will involve a deception that I think will draw many Christians into it.
I can relate a bit too on how, the things that we're not exposed to in church. I was there in the Missouri Ozarks back in 2012 and went to the Prophecy Summit that was in Branson. And the only speaker that I knew was Tom Horn. And I followed him for many years on his transhumanism, which is the modern version of what the eugenics movement was a century ago. Mm-hmm. And there were so many speakers there, including a couple that are going to be with us in Dallas, L.A. Marzulli and Russ Dizdar. And prior to going to the conference, I didn't really consider myself a spiritual warrior, but I thought that, given a couple of battles that I'd been in, that I'd been to the front line. And after listening to Russ Dizdar, it's kind of like, well, I haven't been to the front line. It's more like neighborhood watch, where I took care of some trespassing and graffiti. It's a real war out there, and it seems like our churches are wide asleep.
Exactly right. I was at that conference as well. In fact, I conducted interviews with all of the speakers at that conference that were then added to the DVD set that was produced later. And that's been a real blessing, because over the last 5 years, I've had the opportunity to do that at a number of conferences, and spoke to Russ, L.A., and many others, the late Dr. Noah Hutchings. That's really been an education for me, as I've been trying to fill in the gaps of things that I should have learned years ago. But this dumbing down, if you will, of the church has been ongoing since the time of St. Augustine, really, who was really the first who began to take the supernatural aspect and the supernatural war out of the Bible. He had come out of the Manichaean heresy, where they placed a lot of emphasis on the giants of Genesis chapter 6, and maybe too much so. And as a reaction, I think, to his heretical beliefs, his previous heretical beliefs, Augustine rejected all of that, and he threw out the baby with the bathwater. As our friend Dr. Michael Heiser points out, and his work has been really influential on me, on Sharon. I know his book, The Unseen Realm, is highly recommended by Tom Horn, calls it the best book he's ever seen on the subject, ever read on the subject. Jews of the first century understood that Genesis chapter 6, that the Nephilim were not only an authentic part of human history, but that incident on Mount Hermon, where the Watchers came down not only to create the Nephilim, but to bring forbidden knowledge to the human race, was a key turning point in human history. That was a key part of the mission of Jesus, in fact, was to overturn and undo that evil that the Watchers had brought to earth. And again, in Jesus' day, the apostles, and really any educated Second Temple period Jew, would have understood that that was a key part of human history, and in fact was mainly responsible for why the world is in such a terrible state, why people sin. It's because of the sin of the Watchers on Mount Hermon. And that's why Mount Hermon is one of the 8 key holy mountains that I include in the book, The Great Inception, in looking at the literal war that's been taking place since creation almost between these lesser Elohim, these lesser gods, small g gods, and their creator, Yahweh.
And, I'm again, going back to the 2012 conference, that took me 2 or 3 months to just try and assimilate everything that was presented there. And, it's kind of like realization after realization. And what really hit me, after college, I spent 8.5 years as an Air Force officer, and I missed the warfare aspect because Satan doesn't operate on a human scale. He operates on that spiritual scale that transcends generations. This is John Regan with Derek Gilbert. We'll be back after this break. This is John Regan at the controls today. We have Derek Gilbert from Skywatch TV. And before the break, I was talking about how Satan works on a different timeline. And why that's important to understand is when you start looking at what's going on in the world and you're trying to assess the situation, we tend to do it from our human point of view, and it also tends to be from our lifetime. And when you're fortunate enough to start moving beyond your lifetime, you start seeing bits and pieces. But when you realize the spiritual warfare aspect of this, and that it goes beyond the human lifetime, you start seeing more connections of how this all fits together. And you can spend a lot of time on that, and I don't recommend immersing yourself on that because there's more important things in life. We're here to serve, and we do need an understanding, but if all we do is study, we're missing out the bigger picture. So, Derek,
some are called to it, some are called to it, and some are not. So,
true. So, where would you like to go?
Well, I think you raise a good point, and regarding the long time scale that we're talking about, one of the things that I noticed when looking at the biblical worldview of the original Massachusetts colony was that when you look at time, the timeline of history from a distance, you can see that there are certain things that happened specifically to achieve a particular end for God, and that kind of view is helpful also was helpful in the research that I did for the book, The Great Inception. You look at certain things that took place in history, and they had to happen in a certain way in order to achieve a specific spiritual goal. In the case of the United States, and this is not something I get into in the book, but you look at the first few centuries of Christianity and how the early church was persecuted by the Jewish ruling authorities, the Sanhedrin, but also the Roman Empire, until the early 4th century, where the enemy changed tactics and decided to corrupt the church from within. It was clear they weren't going to crush it from the outside, so they began to rot it from the inside, first by legalizing the faith of the Roman Empire, and then by making it the official faith of the Roman Empire. And once becoming a Christian became a path toward wealth and power, the rot began to set in. But you look at then the ability to travel safely across the ocean, which really wasn't developed until about the 16th century, consistently anyway. And it was the early 17th century when the Pilgrims left England, first to Holland and then to the United States, or what became the United States. These certain things happened just at the time that they were able to achieve a specific supernatural goal. Jesus appeared on earth just at the peak of the power of the Roman Empire, when one could safely travel pretty much from China to Britain and spread the gospel pretty much to the ends of the earth. Had Jesus come earlier, such travel wouldn't have been possible. If Jesus had come later, after the Roman Empire fragmented and the barbarian invasions from the east and the north pushed in, it would have been much more difficult. Jesus appeared at the right moment in history to travel to pretty much all of the civilized world, the first possible date to travel to all of the civilized world and begin to spread the gospel of salvation. And again, all of history was working toward that moment, and then his future return. And again, the great inception is about the plans of the enemy. It's more than just Satan. There are a number of gods, small g gods, that have been active throughout history. We can't identify them by name for certain, but we can identify specific points in history and specific things in the Bible that God worked through his prophets and apostles to defeat their plans.
This is John Regan with Derek Gilbert. We'll be back in a few minutes. And this is John Regan sitting in for Vincent while he's out taking care of the farm. We have Derek Gilbert with us today. And while you were talking last segment, I was thinking about how Christians today are ignorant just of our own history here in America. The First Amendment was there to keep us from having a national religion, which if you were from Europe, you'd understand most of Europe was Catholic. And if you weren't Catholic, you were part of the Church of England, which is, kind of a clone of that. And we also, we get into the Second Amendment, biblically we're supposed to be able to defend ourselves. And instead of hiring an army, you were the army, if your country was attacked. We've lost sight of that. And without that knowledge, you're just sitting there defenseless against the accusations that the left does. And, and we're playing right into the enemy's hands. And one of the saddest surveys I've seen is that 60% of Christians don't believe in Satan. And if you don't believe the enemy exists, if you don't know the enemy, you've already lost a big part of the battle.
Absolutely. And that same survey, which it was by the Barna Group in 2009, if I remember correctly, also found that a large percentage of American Christians don't believe that the Holy Spirit exists. They just consider it a symbol of God's love. So again, that's my contention that we're in the middle of a long war. The Bible records this war, but that's not the way it's presented to us in most churches. Pastors don't believe it, so of course the average Christian in the pew is not going to believe it. And so we're in the middle of a battlefield, most of us, with no clue as to where the incoming fire is. Who's launching these rounds at us. difficult to work up a good righteous anger against the culture around us. So we don't know enough Bible to know what we ought to be angry about, or who we're supposed to be angry at. I mean, the Apostle Paul made it very clear in Ephesians 6:12. We're not wrestling against human opponents. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and rulers of spiritual darkness. Those are literal evil intelligences, supernatural entities who want to destroy us. And so once I began to understand this, which, being perfectly honest, was not until I hit late adulthood, it became kind of a no-brainer for me. I mean, why wouldn't you want to understand and learn everything you could about the entities, the enemy who wants to kill me, kill my family, and kill everyone and everything that I love?
Yeah, one of the lessons you get being an officer in, I imagine, any branch of our military, is that you have to know your enemy. I also went through an MBA program while I was in the Air Force, and from the business side, it's know your competition. But it seems like we go to church and it's, do you know the potluck we're having?
Or God is presented as, Jesus is presented as a sort of life coach. God is presented as a sort of genie in a bottle, that if you pray the right prayer, he is obligated to give you what you want. That is a completely inaccurate understanding, and I'm trying to choose nice words here, of our relationship to the creator of the universe. Yes, he loves us and loves us beyond our understanding, but he gives us what we need, not necessarily what we want, because our wants are often based on immature understandings and desires that really are not what's best for us. In the same sense that, a 3-year-old, when given a choice of anything that they could possibly have for breakfast, will choose the candy instead of the healthy breakfast. Of course, many of us adults are guilty of the same thing. But the point is that what we want is not necessarily what we need. God is not obligated to give us what we want. And furthermore, there are entities out there that were worshipped in the ancient world as gods, who are actively trying to convince us of this incorrect understanding of God. There was a line in a popular movie from about 15 years ago, The Usual Suspects, that actually quotes a short story from the 19th century by the French author Baudelaire. The line is, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled is convincing the world he didn't exist. And here in the West, that's true. Now, if you talk to missionaries who go to Africa or other parts of the world that aren't blinded by science, they have a much more personal connection to the supernatural realm. They may not understand it correctly, but they at least acknowledge that it exists. A gentleman has become a friend of ours, a Lutheran scholar by the name of Reverend Dr. Robert Bennett, has written a book called I Am Not Afraid, which is based on his experience visiting the island of Madagascar and visiting the Lutheran church there, which is growing very rapidly. On his very first day there, at a ceremony for one of the local churches, a woman, as they began to pray to open the ceremony, fell down at his feet, began screaming and thrashing and foaming at the mouth. And he asked his guides, what's going on with her? And immediately a group of people, lay people, ran up and began performing an exorcism on this woman. And he asked, what's going on? I mean, his first thought, coming from Michigan and being raised in our technologically advanced culture, was that they were having a joke at the expense of the new guy. But then he remembered, wait a minute, we didn't even decide to attend this event until we were already in the car. We changed plans midway. They didn't have time to set this up as a joke. And they said, oh, well, she's possessed, and we're performing an exorcism to get rid of the demon. Does this happen often? Oh, yeah, all the time. Here in the West, we'd be likely, calling 911 to get EMTs to the scene and take the woman off to a psychiatric facility where she could be doped up and physically restrained. We've lost that understanding that we are in the midst of a battle. And in Ephesians 6, Paul makes it clear that the passages that follow, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, talk about putting on the whole armor of God. And yet, like I said, many of us, and certainly our most popular pastors and preachers, the guys that, men and women that you see on television every week, have watered down the gospel to make it nothing more than a guide for how to live in this life, instead of understanding we are fighting a war, and the consequences of the decisions that we make in this war are eternal.
And one of the things I did at the last Hear the Watchman conference, my talk was on the cost of ignoring God. And it explains how we've allowed ourselves to get in the position we're in. Because, when I was doing all this research, trying to figure out what went wrong, why did it go wrong, I would see, just for example, our financial side. We don't do things God's way. You're supposed to get rid of the debt every 7 years, and when you do that, you don't get this monstrosity that we have that's going to destroy our economy. Then every 7 of those cycles, you bring the land back together to get things to what would be considered, I guess, a normal level. And that gets rid of the inequity, because you don't get somebody that can just acquire everything and keep it. It has to go back to the various families. And
I would argue, John, that is a part of the enemy. That is a plan of the enemy. You mentioned that when we allow ourselves to become absolutely defenseless in the physical realm, but also, I would argue, in the supernatural realm. But this goes all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer. The way God intended, and this is actually something I speculate on a bit in the book, The Great Inception, that God created us to, go out and be fruitful and multiply, and to work the land and provide for ourselves and for our families. And when you're doing that, anyone who knows a farmer knows, well, as Vincent Finelli's got to take time off so he can go work on the farm. I sang in a quartet with a farmer back in Illinois, and we knew that there were certain weeks in the spring and in the fall where Jeff was not going to be available because he's got things to do out in the field. When you're working a farm and trying to take care of your animals and make sure the crops are growing properly, you don't have time to try to lord it over anyone else. You just physically do not have the time to do it. But very early in history, and archaeologists know this, but of course they're looking at it from a strictly secular perspective. How does the economics of ancient Sumer develop, lead to the development of their very advanced social or structure? They found that even in the days before writing was invented, in ancient Mesopotamia, there was already a stratification of society. There was a class structure that had developed. We're talking, 6,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia, what is now southeastern Iraq. There were planned cities with streets and neighborhoods, and they were all organized around temples. And of course, these temples were to these small g gods, these pagan gods, who decided to rebel against their creator and present themselves to humanity as gods. And it appears that there was a nobility that developed around those temples, because somebody had to tell the people who were out working in the fields, you need to give X amount of your produce, your grain, every year to the temple in order to support the god. And those temple structures became bigger and more ornate and more elaborate. And the temple priests, the ones who spoke on behalf of these pagan gods, apparently, were the ones who made their office hereditary, so that certain families became the nobility and other families became the serfs, the peasants who had to go out and work in the fields. And it was that division of labor. We had some that set themselves up as the rulers. That social structure, I think, was the work of the enemy, intended to draw us away from God's original plan.
This is John Regan with Derek Gilbert. We'll be back after the break. This is John Regan with Derek Gilbert today. We're talking about food, and that's another thing. It goes back to Genesis when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden. There was a curse given to man that he would have to work hard for his food. And you don't have to go back very many generations that our ancestors had to work hard for their food, and they knew how to do that. But with the technology that came around, with the Industrial Revolution, and even more so with the modern technology we have today, where they're even going to work at automating the farms, getting rid of people entirely, we've lost skill sets and knowledge for being able to raise our own food. And that's why when this next collapse comes, it's going to be so deadly. People don't know how to do things, and even those that do work in agriculture don't know how to do things without electricity and petroleum products. And there are some out there, the Amish and people that live that type of lifestyle that know how to do it. But the vast majority, to them, food grows in a grocery store. And, I think it's just another one of those deceptions.
Well, I agree with you. I gave a talk on that at a church in the fall about that as part of a preparedness expo. It all stems back, I think, to getting us away from God's original design for humanity, the way we were supposed to live, even the roles that we're supposed to play within the family. But, I was born and raised in Chicago, even though my mother was raised on a farm in the middle of North Dakota. She thinks it's pretty funny. I made it to the age of 50 before I knew what silage was. Because, you raised on a farm, you just know that's okay. That's, the stubble left over and we just, feed that to the cattle once it's been, allowed to ferment for a while. I had no clue. I used to joke with some Amish folk I knew back in Illinois, where we lived very close to the largest Amish enclave in the state, that I was going to camp out with them if things really hit the fan, until I learned enough to take care of my family and ourselves. We now live in a rural area where we're a little more, we're moving toward a little more self-sufficiency. But I've got a long way to go. I flatly admit that if things were to break down tomorrow, I would be one who'd have to learn in a hurry a bunch of skills that I was never raised with.
And I also wanted to touch on, we talk about these little g gods of old. When I was in fourth grade and we started studying mythology and what's recorded, and I remember talking with another student during that time, and she was saying that, this was fiction. And no, that's not what it is. Myth and legend kind of fill in the gaps of history where we don't have complete records. And it does give us insight into what was happening back then. And I see you're going to be covering that in your book.
Yeah, there are a couple of examples. One takes a little while to explain, and I don't think we've got time before the top of the hour to cover that. But one I will point out that's a very prominent story in the Old Testament. In 1 Kings, we read quite a bit about the evil king of the northern kingdom, Israel. This is after Israel and Judah had separated into two separate kingdoms, Ahab. King Ahab, of course, was married to Jezebel, who was the daughter of the king of Tyre. His name was Ethbaal, which means man of Baal, Baal being one of the main antagonists, one of the villains in the Old Testament narrative. Baal was really a title that became a proper name over the course of history. It just means Lord, in the same way we say the Lord instead of Yahweh. They referred to the storm god, the Semitic storm god Hadad, as Baal, Lord. Well, the city of Tyre, during the time of Hiram, who was the king during the time of David and Solomon, made another god called Melkart, the chief god of the city. And the prophets of Baal that Elijah confronted on Mount Carmel, where 400 of them were destroyed in one moment, when God displayed his mastery over that Baal, that Lord, Melkart. Melkart was just the Phoenician name for Hercules. Elijah defeated the priest of Hercules.
It's John Regan with Derek Gilbert. We'll be back after the top of the hour break. Welcome back to USA Prepares. This is your captain, John Regan. I'm sitting in for Vincent this week as he's taking care of his farming duties. We have with us Derek Gilbert from Skywatch TV. And I know we're running out of time last hour, but what caught me there is one of the things we have to deal with is, ever since our language got confused, there are many names for the same thing or many names for the same person. And sometimes we don't see the picture because we're only used to seeing that one slice of it. And I don't remember who I was listening to when they said that Gilgamesh was another name for Nimrod.
Mm-hmm.
And why that gets to be critical in today's time. It goes back to the Gulf War, and this was before Bush did his mission accomplished thing on the aircraft carrier. We went into the tomb of Gilgamesh and got his body, and the reports are it was in an amazing state of preservation. And that means we have in our possession his DNA. And given the technology that we now have, it's not too much of a stretch that we could have the body of Nimrod that could be inhabited by his spirit.
Well, that's interesting speculation, but what it does, there was in fact a British archaeological team that, or rather a German team, it was reported by the BBC in March of 2003, just before the U.S. invaded, that the tomb of Gilgamesh had been found at underneath what would have been a course of the Euphrates River at that time. It's shifted its course since then, but it would have been under the river at the time that the grave was put down there. Now, I've not seen any evidence or any reports on what happened since then, but it's certainly possible that the body was exhumed by the archaeologists who were working there. I know that there are reports of things that were taken from the museum in Baghdad, old artifacts that have not turned up, at least publicly, since then, and only God knows where those things are these days. In my research, I tend to follow the work of Egyptologist David Rohl, who contends that the Sumerian king Enmerkar, who was 2 generations before Gilgamesh, matches up with the biblical description of Nimrod. Enmerkar is a compound word. En means Lord, and Kar is a suffix that means hunter. And in the book of Genesis, we read that Nimrod was described as a mighty hunter before the Lord. Nimrod was the 2nd generation after the flood. According to the Sumerian king list, which is a record of who ruled over ancient Sumer when Enmerkar was the 2nd king after the flood swept over. But the evidence is even more than just pegging when the king ruled after the flood. There's a poem that's survived from ancient Mesopotamia called Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta. And no one's really sure where this land Aratta was. It might be Armenia, which in the time of David was called Urartu. Of course, Ararat is that same region. That's where Noah landed the boat. So it's possible that it was in that area. But the point of this poem that survived is that this king Enmerkar, who I believe was Nimrod, was putting the screws to this kingdom because it had lots of raw materials, lumber and jewels and precious metals and things you don't find in southeastern Iraq, which is where Nimrod's kingdom, Uruk, was located. Now, the Bible tells us the center of his kingdom was Babel and Erech, E-R-E-C-H. Scholars spell the name of the city U-R-U-K, Uruk. We still call it 5,000 years later by the same name, Iraq. That's how influential Nimrod was. Why did Nimrod need building materials, things that he couldn't get from the sand or from the marshy area of southeastern Iraq? Well, he wanted to rebuild a temple in his home city, or build a temple to the goddess Inanna, who, as you mentioned correctly, John, just another example of the same entity known by different names throughout history. Inanna isn't a familiar name to us, but we've heard of Ishtar. We've also heard of Venus and Aphrodite. Astarte was the Canaanite name. They were all the same entity, the goddess of sex. And when I mean sex, I mean gender-fluid, extramarital, carnal sex, and the goddess of sex and war. That was one of the things that this king Enmerkar wanted to do, build this big, glorious temple to make Inanna the patron goddess, the patron deity of his city, and thus his kingdom. That was Nimrod's guiding star, was the goddess Inanna / Ishtar / Venus. But the other thing he wanted to do was build up a temple at a city called Eridu. And this is why in the book, The Great Inception, I argue that Eridu was the site of the Tower of Babel, not Babylon. Babylon didn't even exist when Nimrod walked the earth. Babylon didn't even become Babylon as we know it from the Bible until about the time of Abraham. I mean, when Abraham was coming out of Ur, and I also argue in the book that it was not southeast Iraq like we are normally taught, but it was in southern Turkey. But when Abraham was being called by the Lord to go to Canaan, was about the time that a group of people called the Amorites were setting up this new kingdom centered on an unimportant little village named Babylon. Nimrod, or Enmerkar, the Sumerian king, probably lived 12 or 1300 years earlier. But there is a city that the Mesopotamians, the Sumerians, remembered in their records as being the very first city. When kingship was lowered from heaven, it descended at Eridu. And archaeologists have found in digging at Eridu the remains of the largest and the oldest ziggurat, which is that Mesopotamian step pyramid. Of course, the Egyptians later copied that shape for their own pyramids. The oldest and largest ziggurat in Mesopotamia is at Eridu, not at Babylon, not at Ur, or any of the other famous cities of the ancient Sumer, but it was at Eridu. It was a temple to a god called Enki. Enki, like Enmerkar, is a compound word. Enki means Lord of the earth. Now we look at the Bible and we find that there's an entity that Jesus called God of this world or Prince of this world. Of course, that's Satan. The other key fact about this temple, the temple to the god Enki, was called the Abzu, means house of the Abzu. The Abzu was this body of fresh water that existed beneath the temple. So he was the god who provided the fresh water that was necessary to life, because when you live in a desert like Iraq, you die without the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So this god Enki in ancient Sumerian art is depicted with two streams of water flowing out of his shoulders, one representing the Tigris, the other representing the Euphrates. He was the god who brought, he was also the god of wisdom and magic, and the god who brought the gifts of civilization to humanity, sort of the Prometheus of Sumerian legend. He was the god who brought enlightenment to humanity. He was also the god who sent forth these creatures called the Apkallu to bring the gifts of civilization to humanity. And a scholar a few years ago by the name of Amar Anus wrote a paper, and he showed that the Apkallu were actually the Watchers. When the Mesopotamians knew about the Watchers, they just called them the Apkallu, and they were the creation of this god Enki, who lived in this Abzu, this body of water beneath his temple at the city of Eridu. The Watchers, of course, are the angels who came down at Mount Hermon in Genesis 6, brought forbidden knowledge, created the Nephilim. That all comes from this god Enki. Well, this king Enmerkar, Nimrod, wanted to rebuild the Abzu, the house of the Abzu, and make it a glorious shining mountain. This is in the poem Enmerkar and the Lord of Harada. A glorious shining mountain. He wanted to make it the abode of the gods. And this is a phrase we come across a number of times in Mesopotamian literature, but also in Second Temple Jewish literature. It refers to a holy mountain. And Ezekiel 28 tells us that Eden was the holy mountain of God. We know that God's throne is now established on Mount Zion. That is the holy mountain of God. But the pagan gods also had holy mountains. Mount Hermon was one. Mount Zaphon it's on the Turkish border with Syria, right on the Mesopotamia or the Mediterranean coast. That was where Baal's palace was located. Of course, Mount Sinai during the Exodus was where God met face to face with Moses, Aaron, and the 70 elders of Egypt. That was a holy mountain. But in Sumer, southeastern Iraq, there are no mountains. They had to create an artificial mountain. That's what Babel was. Bab Elu in the Akkadian means gate of the gods. This was to be a gateway to the spirit realm, which this king, Nimrod, Enmerkar, the Sumerian king, wanted to create above the Abzu. He wanted to create an artificial holy mountain to serve as the abode of the gods right there in southeastern Iraq. And it's at this point I should point out that Abzu is the word from which we get the English word abyss. This king, Nimrod, wanted to create a holy mountain, an artificial holy mountain, to serve as a gateway to the spirit realm, the abode of the gods, right there above the abyss. So when God came down, when Yahweh came down and said, let's put a stop to this, confuse their language, it wasn't just because humans were getting too prideful, too big for their britches. And if God would come down and intervene every time humans got a little too uppity, he'd be down here every week. This was something really specific that had to be stopped. And I believe it has to do with what is recorded in this Sumerian poem that scholars dug up about 150 years ago and translated. That Nimrod, Enmerkar, was trying to create a literal dwelling place for the gods right there in his kingdom.
This is John Regan with Derek Gilbert. We'll be back in a few minutes. This is John Regan at the controls today. Have Derek Gilbert from Skywatch TV with us. You know, I was thinking while you were talking, there was, or have been a number of the clay tablets from Sumer found. And I was reading an article on that years ago, so I may not have all the facts straight, but I believe it was from the British Museum, and it was a tablet talking about something, you know, just ordinary life. I believe it was like an agriculture, either a transaction or an inventory. And then when it got to the backside where they dated it, it was like, you know, 3 years after the completion of the ship for the god Enki. And, you know, it's, you start wondering exactly what was going on. And I even wonder, what type of ship was it? You know, was it a water ship, an airship, or a spaceship? We don't know. Certainly, you know, the fallen angels brought certain technology to Earth. I remember, again, going back to the 2012 Prophecy Summit, you know, L.A. Marzulli was there talking about these flying saucers that the Nazis built. There were 2 different programs, and each were associated with a group of witches. And you start getting more and more bizarre connections. Of course, the Nazis had a base in Antarctica, which is something that's heating up, pardon the pun, lately, where we've had all these world leaders go down there, and I don't think they're going down there to look at ice and penguins.
I would suspect not. I know that there were, and I'm not an expert on the religious rituals and rites of the ancient world. I've done a lot of reading on this over the last year, but that doesn't make me an expert by any stretch. I believe there was an annual ceremony where they had to travel the god, which was localized in an idol. I mean, idols were not worshipped in the ancient world. And this is another misconception that we have in our churches, that the pagans of the ancient world were actually worshiping the little blocks of wood and stone that were carved to represent their gods. Those idols gave locality to the god, so that they knew where, you know, what direction to face when they were praying to it. But the block of stone wasn't the god itself. But every year that they would make a trip, if I remember correctly, and I could be wrong about this, but they would make a trip in the boat from the various temples, Inanna from Uruk, Enki from Eridu, and they would go to Nippur, which was the city of the chief god Enlil, and they would meet at the temple there of Enlil. That may be what was referred to on the backside of that tablet. It's a really interesting deception that the enemy has worked through these ancient gods. Everything that we know about them comes from the post-flood era, pretty much, because writing was not invented until after the post-flood era, or at least nothing that we can identify as pre-flood. Nothing written that we can identify as pre-flood has come down to us. It's believed that writing was invented in Sumer around the year 3000 BC or thereabouts by this king Enmerkar, who I believe is Nimrod. So all we know is what took place after the flood, at least in terms of what the Sumerians wrote down about their gods. But as I mentioned in the first hour, over the last 150 or 200 years, as these tablets have been dug out of the sand in places like Iraq and Syria and western Iran, southern Turkey, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and then translated by scholars, the deception, the original deception, of course, was that these fallen angels, if you want to call them that rather than gods, that's fine. These false gods deceived the ancient world into worshiping them instead of the Creator. But then, as scholars in the last century and a half have translated these tablets, they have come to the conclusion, and this is the second level of the deception, that the Hebrew Bible, the Bible on which we base our faith as Christians, was simply rehashed Mesopotamian religion, as if the Hebrews, alone among the peoples of history, couldn't come up with their own cosmology. It's a double lie, and it's pulled many very intelligent people away.
It's John Regan with Derek Gilbert. We'll be back after the bottom of the hour break. And this is John Regan with Derek Gilbert. You know, when I was in the Air Force, I spent 3 years in Germany. And God didn't give me the gift of languages, so I started appreciating how difficult it was just translating from one modern European language to another. And it was also at that same time that a movie came out, you've probably seen it, Back to the Future, where you know, they went back 30 years, and we had a humorous scene in there, you know, at the counter where Marty was trying to order something, and you know, you find out just how much words change in the same language over 30 years. And you consider the Bible, which is much older than that. You've got a Middle Eastern language. You have cultural differences. We also, again, in our modern age, don't understand the agricultural references that, you know, Jesus often uses to teach. So it is a challenge for learning. And another rabbit trail, you know, the calendar we use, which comes from the Romans, it's kind of interesting when you learn what the words mean. Most of it are for months dedicated to gods or Roman emperors who were treated as gods. But not all the months were named. So when you get past August, September, October, November, December, those still retain their numbers. The Sept is 7, Oct is 8, Novem 9, and December 10, like, you know, decade and decimal, all of those references. So once you learn that, you start seeing, well, yeah, if December's the 10th month, so you got January, February, that makes March the first month. And now things start lining up a bit. You know, everybody's been exposed to astrology and knows that Aries starts in March. Well, it all lines up. Where does the word March come from? Mars, the god of war.
Right.
Aries, another name for the god of war. So if you look at the calendar we use, the very first month is dedicated to war.
And the transition from a lunar calendar, which of course was specified by God to Moses, which was common in the ancient world, to the solar calendar, was also a big shift in religion and cosmology. One of the things I stumbled across, not intending to, because I wasn't really looking for this, my goal when I started out to write the Great Inception was to look at the importance of these holy mountains throughout history. As I mentioned, Eden was a holy mountain. Most of us think, well, the Garden of Eden. Well, yeah, but Ezekiel 28 makes it clear. It was the holy mountain of God. Then we've got these pagan holy mountains, Mount Hermon, which was not only the mountain where the Watchers descended and hatched their plan to corrupt mankind through procreation and forbidden knowledge. It was known to the ancient Near East as the Mount of Assembly of the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon, El, who, by the way, also took the name that God, the creator God, Yahweh, identified himself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as, El Shaddai. It wasn't until Moses that he told him that his name was Yad-He-Vav-He, Yahweh. Again, part of a deception, a psyop, a psychological operation to change what people believe by feeding us false information. These fallen angels, these false gods, small g gods, have been doing this ever since the garden, the very first lie in the book. Ye shall be as gods. I mentioned Mount Zaphon, which was the holy mountain of Baal, where his temple was located, or his palace, rather, was located. God then, when he called the Israelites out of Egypt, they met at the mountain of God, which is Sinai, Mount Horeb, Mount Paran, different names in the Bible, all referring to the same mountain. And now the battle, the final battle of history, will be for God's holy mountain, where he has now established his throne and has since the time of David, Mount Zion, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The reason there is so much anger, animosity, hatred directed at the Jews for control of the Temple Mount, or wanting control of the Temple Mount, even just wanting access to the Temple Mount, to be honest, is because in the spirit realm, these small g gods know that is where Yahweh is going to establish his eternal throne when the Messiah returns, and they're trying to preempt it. This is what Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28 are all about, wanting to establish another Mount of Assembly or Mount of the Congregation that is supreme, superior to that of Yahweh. But I stumbled onto, in researching all of these mountains and their relationship to human history, this history that's in the Bible, if we know to look at it with eyes open to this divine council concept and the existence of these small g gods, was the importance of the moon god in history. I mean, we're told often that a lot of pagan worship in the Old Testament era was of the sun god, and yes, the sun god, known to the Hebrews as Shamash, was one of the main gods of the pantheon, but it was really the moon god, who was called Sin by the Semites. The Amorites that the Israelites had to push out of Canaan called it Yarik. That was not only more important than the sun god, but there's some evidence that I'm digging up now, again, known to secular scholars, but not known to us in the church, is that it appears that the moon god was the chief god of the pantheon, that the founders of Babylon, who were Amorites, and by the way, I cover some of this in the book, The Great Inception, talking about the sin of the Amorites, or the iniquity of the Amorites, which God mentions to Abraham when they make a covenant, Genesis chapter 15. Your descendants will return from a land that is not their own in the fourth generation, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And that started me down another rabbit trail. What does that mean? Well, the Amorites founded Babylon, and the whole occult system of Babylon was Amorite. There is no ethnicity called Babylonian. Okay? Babylon was founded by Amorites. Its kings were Amorite. Its people were Amorite. Their religion was Amorite. They were Amorite. But the chief god, even though the chief god of Babylon itself, the city god of Babylon, was Marduk, who became the king of the gods in the Babylonian pantheon, the chief god of the founder in the royal house of Babylon that followed the founder of Babylon was Sin, the moon god. So, again, the enemy taking this lunar calendar that God had established with Moses, and even a couple of generations, actually several hundred years before Moses, set up this moon god as the chief god of the pantheon of the Amorites, the ruling house of Babylon. Now, I mentioned that Yarik was the name given to the moon god by the Amorites. That's where the city of Jericho got its name. I mean, you know anything about Semitic languages, you know that we often substitute a J in English for a Y in the Semitic, like Hebrew. So Yerik, Jericho, same name. In fact, there was an Amorite tribe that also took its name from the moon god that may have been their home city. Now, scholars have known for a long time, and some Christian scholars have known that Jericho was the city of the moon god. It was a center of the moon god cult. But what we often overlook in the story of the conquest of Canaan, when Joshua took the Israelites and crossed the River Jordan, and we remember the story, the spectacular imagery of the Israelite priests leading the army into battle instead of the other way around. I mean, most armies throughout history, you put the soldiers in front and the priests are in the back to, bless everything and pray that things go well. With Israel, you put the priests out front because they're doing the Lord's work here, marching around the city with their trumpets on the seventh day, blowing the trumpets, and the walls came tumbling down. But I had never noticed before the timing of the attack on Jericho. As you mentioned, John, the New Year always began in March because December was the 10th month, and then you get January, February. In the lunar calendar, the spring began, the New Year began with the spring equinox, which usually falls in March or thereabouts. And when you read the account in Joshua, you see that after crossing the river, the Israelites celebrated the Passover, which is always on the 15th day of the month of Nisan, the 15th day of the first month of the year. Well, in the lunar calendar, the new month, the new year, begins with the new moon, when the moon is totally blacked out in the sky. And I don't think this is coincidental, but that's when the Babylonians, the Amorites, celebrated their big New Year festival, which is a 12-day festival called the Akitu Festival, honoring the god Marduk in his victory over the chaos dragon Tiamat, basically taking onto Marduk a victory that went to Yahweh, God, because essentially it's Yahweh defeated Leviathan, except in Mesopotamian cosmology, they wanted to give the credit for that victory to the chief god Marduk. As soon as their New Year's festival ended, the Israelites begin celebrating, pretty much about 3 days later, begin celebrating the Passover. The Passover then falls on the full moon, and it's immediately then after the full moon that the attack begins on Jericho. God had Joshua and the Israelites begin the attack on the city of the moon god on the very first full moon of the new year, as if to show this moon god that you follow has no power.
Wow.
And there are multiple examples of things like that throughout the Bible, if you know what to look for.
And we're looking at, spring's about March 20th, where he starts a 12-day celebration, gets you to about April 1st. And one of the theories why they're called April Fools is because they wanted to keep to the old calendar instead of switching to the first month being January. John Regan with Derek Gilbert. We'll be back after the break. This is John Regan with Derek Gilbert. We just have 5 minutes left. So much. I imagine some of you out there, this is the first time you've heard some of this, and I would encourage you, get your tickets to Hear the Watchman, hearthewatchman.com. You can go to my website, thefinancialstateoftheunion.com, click on the news tab, and it's the first link on all my posts going back for quite a while. And it's true, you could get this on DVD and watch and listen to what all the speakers have to say, but it's not the same thing as being there. On the speaker side of things, you get a chance to interact, ask questions, but more importantly, you need to be there for the people that's there, because it's these connections that can really even be the difference between life and death with what's coming. And I can't tell you exactly when, but when it does, it is going to be devastating. I personally have skywatchtv.com as a link that's bookmarked. I go to it daily to check out their news. I subscribe to their YouTube channel. Don't get a chance to watch all that I want to, They do great work. And I guess I'll just turn it over to you, Derek. What do you want to add and wrap up with?
Well, I agree with your assessment, your reasons for attending a conference like this. As you say, you can get the information from the live stream that would be available for this particular conference or the DVD set afterward, but there's something about the fellowship of getting together with other people who see what is going on, who understand that there is more, that there are more people out there who get it, because being aware and awake is not a way to win friends and influence people in our culture, in our world. But the people who get it are not alone. And so attending a conference like this and being able to fellowship with other believers who understand that we're in the middle of a supernatural war, and the stakes are literally the souls of our families, our friends, and everyone that we love. So that is really uplifting. That's, I guess, one of the things that really surprised me when I started attending these prophecy conferences and then began interviewing speakers and then began speaking at these conferences myself. The topics can be really frightening, but only if you're coming at this from a secular worldview. I mean, you see that there are bad things happening in the world around us and that things are likely to get worse economically, politically. Here in the United States, it's my belief that we're headed toward a Balkanization where, like the former Yugoslavia is now broken up into Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Kosovo. We may wind up broken up into smaller enclaves here in the United States. We shouldn't assume that we're going to be around forever in this political structure. History, if it tells us nothing else, just looking back over 6,000 years of recorded history, we should know that diversity plus proximity equals violence. So, but if you understand that God foresaw all of this and has an end game worked out that will provide for all eternity the security that you and your family truly need and want, you can attend a conference like this and get all of this information and still come away feeling uplifted and encouraged and energized. And that's not to say that any of us are saying, God's got it all worked out, so just sit back and go to sleep. Not at all. We know we're in a fight for our lives, but we've read the end of the book and we know who wins.
And Christianity is not a spectator sport.
Amen.
Well, Derek, thank you for being with us today, and I'll be talking with you later.
And I look forward to meeting you in Dallas.
Remember, class, honesty and integrity. What happens next is up to you.